And I'm going to do something that everybody has been asking for, and it's long overdue, really, because it's foundational to who we are as a bakery. I'm going to tell you a little bit about Harriet, how we manage Harriet as a sourdough starter, and just give you a whole thing. So to get started, we're going to feed Harriet. It looks like I got to see if this is my cold water or my warm water. So whenever you're feeding a sourdough starter, it's really no different than mixing a dough, where water temperature becomes important. So I want to use my warmer water, my 80-degree water. I need a little bit more of it. This is going to be a small feeding for us. We call these feedings refreshes. And so it's only going to be one bucket. For us on a typical day, when we're starting our mixing day, we're mixing 4, 5, sometimes 6 of these. But this is the off mix. So we feed our sourdough starter multiple times a day, twice to be exact right now. In the past, it was 3 times. But we have a little bit more control over temperature now, so we can get away with less feeding. And that's actually a really, really important thing to discuss with a sourdough starter. Is managing a sourdough starter boils down to how well you can manage the fermentation, which boils down to how well you can manage the temperature of your surroundings. So I've got beautifully mature starter right now. You should take a look at Harriet. This is what's going into our doughs this morning. Now, I'm giving it a smell. It smells clean and fresh, slightly acidic. If it goes much further, it's going to start sort of knocking you off your face. And that's a little bit far from me. I'm mainly looking for a huge amount of bubbles. If I look at the side, I should see sort of even bubbles throughout to sort of measure how mature the starter is. I'm also giving it a smell test all the time before I use it. I think one of the common mistakes with sourdough starters is that they aren't used at the right maturity level. A lot of people, it's been very trendy in the past couple years to use young sourdough starters in bread production. Young sourdough starter meaning one that has been fed and is used anywhere between, I've seen as low as 45 minutes, which is insane, and just a couple hours. A lot of this goes back to this obsession with open crumb, because the longer that your sourdough starter matures, the more acidity that it compiles. This lactobacillus is still actively reproducing, bringing that acid load. But along with that comes flavor, along with that comes better overall fermentation, more even fermentation. And so I feel like we're missing the forest for the trees when we mix with a really young starter. We're going for a particular aesthetic result in our crumb structures, but we're sacrificing full fermentation along the way. In experienced hands, like some of the bakeries around the world that make beautiful open crumb bread, they can find the right balance. But in inexperienced hands, namely bakers that don't see hundreds of loaves a week, but rather maybe 1 or 2 at home a week, if that, there's just so much room for under fermentation. There's so many people that will post photos of their bread where they see these big open holes in part of their crumb, and then the rest of their crumb is dense. A lot of times it's the top that's all open, and people get really excited that they've produced an open crumb. It's very irregular and very uneven. And I suppose that if that brings a lot of delight, great. You know, bread is a very subjective thing. You don't need to do it any particular way. But there is something that is to be said for even fermentation and for that nice balanced final result that has beautiful flavor, beautiful texture, that I can then actually take into a bread science realm and talk about the breakdown of phytates, the breakdown of lectins, the breakdown of gluten actually as fermentation continues. So I can start to point to nutritional benefits for even and long fermentation that can be backed by scientific publication. And I find that to be more important than just the aesthetics of an irregularly open crumb. You get an open crumb with full fermentation too, but it's the type of open crumb that to me is a little bit better. You know, you can still have a sandwich, you can spread anything you want on that bread, but also at the same time, the little holes seem to capture more layers, and so if you spread butter or whatever else, maybe if you're vegan, maybe it's olive oil, but the loaf grabs more of it because of the openness, not less of it. And that's really what I'm going for. So back to Harriet. You have a mature version here. I'm completely happy with it not going in the doughs yet because I started to cool it down in our walk-in this morning. Let's go ahead and get a temperature reading on Harriet. And that's going to give me a lot of indicator on what I can expect for the next hour or two as I'm still using this particular levain in the bakery. Now, because I cooled it down in the fridge, I've got a temperature of 65. When thinking about a sourdough starter, temperature is vital because fermentation rates at different temperatures vary. So in the 80s, fermentation is kind of at a peak for both the lactobacillus and the yeast. As temperature goes down, fermentation slows, and it does so on a curve. So the difference between 70 degrees and 80 degrees in temperature, from my study and understanding, is a halving effect. So temperature is, so 70 degree dough will ferment at half the speed as 80 degree dough. The other thing that happens though is that if you can cool your sourdough starter or your doughs at the right intervals, then you can slow fermentation in order to gain control over the timing of your production. This is really what separates a professional from an amateur baker all day long. When we first started, even though we were a bakery, and so the implication is professional, and I suppose that to some extent, you know, a lot of what we're doing was professional, to be able to hand mix as many breads and to be able to hand mix croissant dough, to laminate by hand, and to actually have a product at the end that you're proud of is a feat, to be sure. But we were missing a lot of professional skills that make baking, well, frankly, more enjoyable. There's something very stressful about having to be ruled by microorganisms. And when you have no control over the temperature, you are being ruled 100% by microorganisms. There's millions of them and one of you, and you just cannot compete. A dough or sourdough starter that's warm is a dough or sourdough starter that is moving. And so if you don't know how to relegate the temperatures well to your advantage, you're going to have a really hard time mixing your doughs at the right times, controlling the fermentation of your doughs so that you can divide and scale them at the right times. If you're working with 1 or 2 loaves at home, you don't really get to even see some of the effects of temperature and time because you don't have an entire batch of bread that's following the one that you're currently working on. When you're working at scale with different mixes, all of which have to follow these fermentation curves, what you find is that if you're not in control over fermentation, temperature, and time, then you're going to get behind. And once you get behind, all the work that you're doing feels like a waste. Because one thing you can't do with baking is take a process that's gone too far and reverse course or turn back the clock. In that sense, baking is not a very forgiving thing to do, because once something is overproofed, there's a couple tricks that I could have up my sleeve to handle it, but they're very limited. So now I have 2 times the water at 80 degrees, 2 times the flour, again it's 80-degree flour because we measured it earlier, and 1 times the sourdough starter. So in this case it's 2 kilograms, I'm going by weight, of sourdough starter to 4 kilograms of flour and 4 kilograms of water. So this, I would call this a 1-2-2 refresh, which in technical terms has 100% hydration because there's exactly the amount of water as there is flour in the dough. So this is what a lot of people would refer to as a liquid starter. A liquid starter is one that typically has the same or more water in its feeding ratios as it does flour. A stiff starter is one that has less water than flour in its feeding ratios. Stiff meaning the dough itself is stiff. So instead of it being kind of gooey and more liquidy, because this isn't completely liquid, meaning it's not completely runny, but the stiffer it is, the more it's like a dough and less like a goop. I think that the texture of this sourdough starter at 100% is goop, would be the best way to put it. So I'm mixing this by hand. I put the water first, then I put flour, then I put sourdough starter. I don't think it necessarily matters a whole lot whether you put the starter or the flour in positions 2 and 3, but I do think that there is some importance when mixing in buckets like this to start with water. And the primary reason is that with water going in first, it seems to be easier to prevent dough or flour rather from clumping on the sides unmixed. I'm going to take a little bit of time with this just to make sure as I'm mixing through that I don't feel any major chunks of flour. Most of that would ferment out because these microorganisms in here are voraciously consuming what's in here, namely the flour. The water medium basically activates it for the microorganisms to feed. So this goes from something that's shelf stable to something that is being fed on. So while if there's a few chunks, you might find that those chunks disappear after 8 hours because the microorganisms seem to go after them kind of from the inside out. But if the chunks are bigger, meaning above, say, the size of a nickel, those will be there, and they will be there in your final dough. They'll kind of follow you through the entire process. Not to mention, some of them will stay in your base sourdough starter, so the next time you go to refresh your sourdough starter, you're going to be facing more resistant clumps, and we'll have to do more work to deal with them. So I have now mixed that guy. I'm going to spray off my hand. My daughter has come in here and asked me if this hurts. And the truth is that it's a little bit tingly, but I don't really feel it anymore because I do it every day. I will say that it's a heck of a lot better than the alternative. So kind of going back into time, imagine a sink in this bakery that at one time or another had no drain line attached to it the first day that we brought it in. Instead, we had like bins below it that we emptied every couple hours until we put in a drain line. And we didn't have a sprayer. I can't say enough about these little spray nozzles. They don't cost very much. I think getting this entire setup, if you can manage to install it yourself, probably wouldn't set you back more than $100 all in all. I mean, with the piping and everything. And it really was one of those small things that was a pretty big game changer for us. Just being able to stay clean. 'Cause anything I do, I can just go and spray, whether it be a bin or a bowl. So you can go to your local restaurant supply store and pick one of those up. That's what we did. And we just paired it with a secondhand sink. So all in all, our 3-compartment sink setup was not very expensive. We started with a much larger 10-foot long 2-compartment sink. It took up this entire wall that the sheeter's on, except it used to be over here by this opening. This whole place has been reworked. The entryways have been reworked. In fact, we actually wanted an entire wall, so we changed how to get into the residence. It used to be right there on that wall behind the sheeter, and the sheeter didn't have a wall to be on, so it was floating in the middle of the floor space. Really quite annoying from a spatial perspective. So now I have the sourdough starter refreshed. I'm going to let this tool go into the sani bucket. And now we're going to do the final active step. I'm going to take a piece of painter's tape. I've dried my hands because if you try to do this right after mixing the sourdough starter by hand, you've gone and washed your hands clean, and you come over with wet hands, not only will the tape not adhere, but your permanent marker that you use to draw on it will immediately be ruined for life. So save yourself a few Sharpies and dry your hands before you do this. I put the tape where the top of my mix is, so you can see that. And now I'm going to write exactly what's in here. So I have 2K flour, I have 2K water, I have 2K starter, I have 4K flour, and I have 4K water. 2, 4, 4. You could just write 10K, I suppose, but by splitting this up, I now know that this is a liquid starter. And I'll explain why that's important in a second. But the time of day right now is 7:30 in the morning. I'm going to write the date as well, and I'm going to write my initials on here. And by labeling it this way, this is scale proof, really, the way that this is labeled. This meets kind of standards for labeling things in a restaurant setting. It means that anyone can go back to this bin and know exactly when it was mixed, the time that it was mixed, the amount that's in here, what exactly is in here, and who did it. And that way we can have sort of traceability if there's any issues later on with anything to point it out. The other important note is, where am I starting as far as temperature? Critical to know this information. And I am starting right at 80 degrees, pretty happy. In the winter time, I'd be upset if it was this low, because in this space, in the winter time, the temperature would drop more quickly. And so the process would slow more quickly than I want the process to slow. So I am mixing a white sourdough starter. The flour that I fed this refresh is a white bread flour. That's what it's always been since we bought the bakery. You can have whole grain sourdough starters, you can have rye sourdough starters, you can have all kinds of sourdough starters, and they all have different properties and different uses. A white sourdough starter is considered homo-fermentive as opposed to hetero-fermentive. Its properties tend to be milky and mild. Maturity times for a white sourdough starter fed at a 1-to-2 ratio, like we did here, are typically between 6 and 8 hours at 80 degrees. So what I'm trying to do is drop the temperature of this sourdough starter into a more of a temperature stable range, which is in the 40s by that 8-hour mark. I want it to go through its fermentation, and then I want it suspended. I want it to start suspending at peak in the 40s. So what I'm going to do with it is I'm going to leverage the fact that I have cold rooms around me to cool it down at the right interval. Now, again, I've learned this for what my temperature is. I vary this throughout the year, and this starts to get a little bit more advanced. But by cooling it down at the right moment, I've got mature starter for longer. And so my window within which I can mix with it increases. If I leave it at room temperature, then it's going to go through that bell curve much more quickly, and I'm going to find myself on the bottom of that bell curve potentially before I can keep up. So this has been something that we've done to really slow the process, and primarily because we have an extremely active and robust starter. So the difference being that I have this mature bucket, which now you can see the flip side of this. You can see that when I fed this last night, it has basically doubled in volume. So even though there's only this much material in here, 10 liters of material, if you look at the scale, it's showing as though it'd be 16 liters of material right now. And you can see that there's no indication of receding in the bucket. So as the sourdough starter matures, what you'll find is that you'll see that it starts to recede downward. And over time, it's going to get closer and closer back down to where it originally started, that original line at 10. And that's the gases escaping. And you can really equate that to the activity level escaping, or the cell population beginning to decline in your microorganisms that are in here. We really want to mix at peak. We want to be using the sourdough starter when all of the cell multiplication has occurred, that's going to occur, meaning all the food and nutrients that these microorganisms have to multiply has been exhausted. You can measure this by smell, I think, more than any other way. You can also measure this by seeing the texture of your starter. If you jiggle it about, you can see it. We haven't really reached peak yet. I think I did a little bit too good of a job of cooling it down. And because it's June, that's the error we're going to make if we're going to make an error, is we're probably going to overcompensate for how hot it is around us. It's so hot outside right now, and as a result, this bakery struggles to keep up. So I'm trying to cool things down more than anything else. I probably overshot it because I can just tell texturally that I'm happy with this, but I would be happy if it was just a little bit more active. So if I jiggle it, it would actually start to break down a little bit more because it has expanded and multiplied to the point that it just can't anymore. And you can sort of see it in the strength of the resulting goop. Just like the dough strengthens and then starts to weaken, this one still seems like it's got a little bit of room to strengthen before it starts to weaken. Not much, but just a little. So am I happy mixing with it? Yes. Have we passed that curve that I was discussing where people are mixing too early? Oh, gosh, yes. People are mixing with starters much, much younger than this that have no smell. People are mixing, they're coming to their starter and they're mixing when it just smells like flour and water still. The smell graduates to one that kind of smells like bananas, and then it graduates to one that smells more and more acidic until it doesn't, and then the smell of a starter that is started to degrade is very particular. And I don't really know a great way of describing it. It's not a smell that I particularly love. It's not like foul, I would say, but it's just not one that I'd say I love. So that's that. We are going to leave this guy in place now, and hopefully we're going to come back and see what happens a little bit later as this guy rises up. So the temperature in this room is about 70 degrees right now, and I expect that temperature to climb over the course of the day. Since this one's sitting at 80, the fermentation is happening effectively at 80 degrees. You can write your temperature down if you'd like. For me, it's more about where we're headed as opposed to where I know where we're starting, and I know we're starting at the right level. I find it to be counterintuitive since I'm specifically manipulating the final temperature to write the starting one. Because by the end, I'm probably going to have a colder starter for when I use it. It will eventually end up in the fridge. So we're at the 6-hour mark here with this sourdough starter that we fed earlier today, and you can see that it's got a doubling in its overall volume, which is great. It still has room to continue on the upswing. It's gone quite a bit for 6 hours, but I can also tell just by the level activity and the smell that we still have some work to do to get to peak. This is a fairly decent time to refrigerate this. I have a nice cold fermentation walk-in that's temping at the low 40s. By putting it in there, it's not going to cool down right away. What is going to happen though, it's going to take probably about 2 hours to cool itself down to a point that it's not really as active anymore. And during that time, it will reach peak maturity. The whole idea is to trap it at this level so that even later on today, so we won't feed again until this evening. So later on today, it will still be at peak when we feed it. So that's what we're going for. I'm just gonna put this guy away now. And I still got a nice temperature in here, so we are good to go. It is hot out right now, so we're always wondering whether those temperatures are okay in the fridges. We're always a little paranoid.